Hello, I'm Robert, voluntary fact checker and helping if you're scared. And this is a debunk that I did earlier to debunk a letter that actually was uploaded by mistake. But the reason I'm doing a video about it is because it helps some of you to understand why Zelensky is no longer prepared to negotiate with Putin. But he's still prepared to negotiate with Russia, and why United States and Ukraine and NATO generally now see it as vital to win this war as the only way forward. They don't see any future in negotiation with Putin. So this letter was accidentally released. They actually signed it in June to July, and it made sense back then, but it no longer makes sense now, because it was urging Biden to negotiate with Putin. But they can't anymore, since Putin annexed the 4 oblasts, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk, in addition to Crimea, which is already annexed. And there's the Russian constitution in 2020 was adjusted, and it required a referendum with the Russian people. It's quite a palaver, and they can change their constitution to say that Russia can never de-annex a region once it's annexed them. So this means that Putin, by annexing those regions, he told Ukraine that as a precondition to any future negotiations, they have to consider Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk as part of Russia, which puts an end to any possibility for Zelensky to negotiate with Putin. You just can't negotiate on those grounds. On the same day, Zelensky signed a decree saying to state the impossibility of conducting negotiations with the President of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. He's still prepared to negotiate with Russia, but not with Putin. And Zelensky and Biden both now see the only way to peace is to win. So Putin does have an off-ramp. His only off-ramp is to leave Ukraine. He doesn't need to sign a peace treaty. If he just leaves Ukraine, then Ukraine is easily strong enough to prevent it invading again, get to some security arrangement with the United States and United Kingdom, Israel, Turkey and places like that to supply it with weapons and keep it supplied. The way things are going, it's going to be pretty much de facto a fully fledged member of NATO apart from the Article 5. But in all other respects, it'll be like a member of NATO by the end of this war. You've shared intelligence, shared capabilities, shared weapons, especially once Russia retreats, they'll get the F-35s, the Patriot air systems, everything. They'll get all the most modern equipment once the war is over, and there's just some nervousness at the moment in sending it over right now because of the kind of grey area of keeping careful. So Zelensky is just basically Russia don't have to come to a peace agreement with Ukraine. They just have to withdraw. Most wars end with a peace treaty, not all. The Korean War didn't end with a peace treaty. North Korea and South Korea still haven't signed a peace treaty, and decades later. So it's not necessary to end a war with a treaty, although it's the usual thing. But if they do have a treaty, then he can't go for a treaty with Putin. Just doesn't see how that's possible. So he just waits for the next president of Russia, whenever that is. That's not, Zelensky didn't spell it out like that. This is my own reading of the situation. But it's definitely the focus of United States and Ukraine is to win this war, and that's the only way they see to peace. Now, not because of any change on their side, because of the impossible situation that Russia has, the preconditions that Russia sets for any negotiation, unless Russia is prepared to change its constitution and de-annex those regions, there's no even starting point for a peace negotiation. So the starting point for peace negotiation is that Putin would have to say, I've just changed the Russian constitution, or I plan to change the Russian constitution. And he's obviously nowhere near that, so it's no possibility at present. Perhaps if he gets pushed out of Ukraine, then at that point he might then say, oh well, I'll negotiate for peace now, on your terms rather than mine. So Zelensky is still ready to negotiate with Russia, but can no longer negotiate with Putin, and that's why. And that doesn't mean that the war drags on, because Ukraine is vastly superior to Russia. Indeed, Russia is going to run out of its shells. It may have already, it may be close to running out already, and without its shells, then it really is very weak. Because it's very weak in its navy is useless against Russia, against Ukraine. It's scared to come closer than 300 kilometers because Ukraine can sink its ships with its Neptune cruise missiles. Its air force is useless. It's pretty useless. I mean, it can still function, but it mainly does bombing attacks against areas already occupied by Russia, or just over the front lines. And if it goes over the front line, the planes fly very low, close to the ground, and then they don't have guided missiles anymore they can fire from their planes. They just kind of do a nose up and try and throw the bomb up into the air as they release it to try and get it to hit somewhere, and then they dash back as quickly as they can. But that's a very risky maneuver, because even flying low, close to the ground, they can get hit by stingers. So Russia basically no longer flies over Ukraine territory, it just fires cruise missiles there from a distance. And Ukraine, it flies sometimes over Russian territory to some extent, but it's Ukraine is getting more confident at flying towards Russia, because its planes can now, it's got the HARM missiles which hit the Russian radar systems. And although they can't, they're still, they're not the equivalent of the F-35s. They couldn't just fly over Russian airspace with Russia hardly seeing them. But they can damage and destroy Russian air systems that try to look at them. So, and they try to look at the artillery systems to fire back. So we now have the artillery, the M77s, which they used to have to move around all the time. They now stay in the same place for days, firing and firing away at Russia. And Russia can't fly back because it's lost so much of its munitions, because of the way the Ukrainians hit the munition stumps, and because it doesn't dare to switch on its radar to look for where the artillery is coming from. So this shows how quickly Putin retreated from the Battle of Kiev. It's really quite extraordinary. Putin, the one thing he's good at is propaganda and basically bluffing and pretending to be different from what he is. Almost any other military leader who retreated from an area the size of Bulgaria would be seen as having lost a big battle. But Putin somehow managed to reframe it so that people still, after doing that, they still have this belief that Putin always escalates and never backs down. I mean, how can you have the idea that Putin never backs down when he retreats from an area the size of Bulgaria in 6 days? or is that someone who never backs down? But he somehow creates this illusion of someone who never backs down. Same with the Battle of Kharkiv. He retreated from that, and he didn't escalate in any way after that. He prepared an escalation, and eventually he started hitting Ukrainian infrastructure, and this seems to be not a retaliation of the Kerch Bridge. It was already planned weeks before the Kerch Bridge. This was a retaliation to the Kharkiv offensive. But it's a pretty feeble one, really, because it's not really going to hit. Is the only thing he's done that is of some military effect. But the main effect it has is that Ukraine has got better and better air defense systems. It's got the IRIS-T systems from Germany that shoot down 9 out of 10 missiles that are fired at them. And it's got more and more Stingers, more and more Gepard, and kind of mobile guns, bit like tanks that fire that can fire drones and shoot them down. And it's got all sorts of systems, and it's getting better and better at shooting them down. So the main effect of Russia, of course, it does have an effect that Ukraine has problems with its fuel, with power over winter, but they are quite hardy people. It's a bit like if I'm in Scotland, and people in Scotland are pretty used to cold weather, and if we didn't have electricity, it would be pretty rough over winter, but we could still have candles, and we could still have, the lights would be on some of it, electricity would be on some of the time, we'd have torches, we'd have generators. Quite a few people have generators in the more remote parts. My parents had a generator at one point before they were connected to electricity, when they were living just up here. So there's a point of several years, maybe even a decade or so, I'm not sure, it's quite a long time, they got their electricity from a generator. And we have a generator, there's a generator shed there in the old house that used to belong to my parents. And then you have wood burning stoves, and you just keep yourself warm by wrapping up and wearing lots of clothes. Back in the old days, they did an awful lot of that. So, but Ukraine probably don't have to resort to that, because they have good engineers. They're repairing their power stations very quickly. They're repairing their electricity substations very quickly indeed. They are getting better and better air defences, and the end result of this will be that Ukraine becomes one of the best equipped air defences in the world, which of course will help them in their counter-offences against Russia. So Russia is making things worse for them as a result of this. The air defense systems, Germany has rushed the first air defense systems to Ukraine already. It's got 3 more on its way. Ukraine, Russia, United States is sending 2, so that's 6 so far. Each one can protect a big city, so that's something like Kiev, Kharkiv, Zaporizhzhia, Odessa, Kherson, once it's liberated. A few others, Lviv, they thought that was a concern, and Mykolaiv, those ones that are often hit by the Russians, and some of those, Zaporizhzhia, Mykolaiv, Kherson, if Ukraine gets it back, then having a big air defense system there would be very effective, and Kharkiv to some extent. Then, although they're protecting big cities, they'd also be they'd be helping with the counter-offensives, because they're close enough to the front lines, so they would protect part of the way into counter-offensive. It extends 50, 70 kilometers, depends on the air system. Patriot, if they ever got that, extends hundreds of kilometers. And it shoots down helicopters and planes and missiles, and it really creates an airspace that Russia can't enter. So their planes can't enter, their helicopters can't enter, their missiles can't have their most of them shot down, get very expensive. You know, if a missile system costs $1 million, you know, more than most, or 100,000 even, then that only 1 in 10 gets through. It means it costs $1 million, because you've got to fire 9, 10, and only 1 gets through. And it's even worse than that, because Russia has basically, of its own systems, enough for about a week of missile attacks. But once Ukraine can shoot down 1 in 10, it's got less than enough for 1 more day left in its entire stocks. And then it relies on Iran. If it's going to try 80 missile strikes a day, which is the amount it's been trying so far. Well, no, 40 got through, I think, the first day. 30, 40 got through. They would need a 10 to 1 ratio, need 300 missiles fired in order to get 30 through. So this air defences makes it very expensive and impractical and difficult for Russia to try to keep attacking Ukraine. And it makes it almost impossible for the Russian planes and helicopters to fly, because you can take those risks with unmanned cruise missiles at a quite low cost. You can't take those risks with a multi-million fighter jet that is fired, that is being flown by an experienced pilot. It's one of your few remaining experienced pilots. You just can't take those risks that 9 in 10 get shot down. So large areas of Ukraine, including major cities and including areas near the front lines, as a result of these senseless attacks on civilian targets, which are not going to cause Ukraine to give up, then as a result of that, this would have happened eventually sometime next year. The German supplies would have come in eventually in 2023. They got their first one already because Egypt, looking at what's happening in Ukraine, said, well, I'll give up my place in the queue to Ukraine. So that wouldn't have happened probably without the infrastructure attacks. That Egypt gave up Cairo's place to Ukraine, saying, Ukraine needs them more than Cairo does, because Russia is attacking its infrastructure. So that's the first one. It would have been and the others, they need to be built them one at a time. But it was going to be 2 months each, but it's now down to maybe 1 month each or something. The next ones will probably be here in November. And then once the United States, the first 2 NASAMS in a couple of weeks, the next ones they'll be rushing them as fast as possible, get them here before winter. Because their priority now is to protect Ukraine before it gets too cold, when they won't be affected by the cold, because they're doing it to protect the civilians in Ukraine and to stop there being a larger refugee problem. Because if they don't do that, there'd be millions more refugees that would leave Ukraine, and it wouldn't stop the army. It would affect the army somewhat, because the army uses electricity a lot. But they could get generators for the army. They can get up their power stations. They'd find ways of keeping the army going. There's no way that Russia's going to eliminate all the power stations. It does affect the army, but the main effects of the civilians, they would end up with millions more civilians being refugees in the EU, in Europe, and the army keeps fighting. And that's the worst case here. The army's not going to stop fighting. Ukraine's not going to lose, it's going to keep winning. And the air defences make it easier for Ukraine to win. So it really is a shooting its own feet as far as the Russians are concerned, doing these attacks against infrastructure. And Ukraine is just going to keep losing. They've stopped. There's no way they can now threaten Moldova or Russia. They pushed back there. This is the area in northern Kherson. So Ukraine recently, these areas in blue, were won back recently, since August. That huge area of Kharkiv, that big area of of northern Kherson. And that area, that's about as big as, nearly as big as Luhansk, that they won back. That's Luhansk, that's Donetsk, that's Zaporizhia, that's Kherson Oblast, that's Crimea. And the Kerch Bridge damaged the supplies to Kherson and Melitopol, which is that blue shaded area. So Melitopol is really quite interesting. So if you look there, that's where Ukraine is, and there's a river there which you can see. I need to get my glasses out. Let's see if I can see it. Yeah, there we are. Molan, that's the river. Goes to Melitopol. That's a natural barrier. There's quite a few rivers here. There's another one there, there's another one up here somewhere. But that's quite a wide river. And so that's a natural barrier. I mean, obviously, they'd have to cut through to it somehow. And then they might use the natural barrier, one side or the other, because it would protect them against Russia on the other side. And this is a big indoor sea. It's a saltwater lake, fed by the river, but saltish, and feeding into the sea. And that's obviously a big barrier. It's a couple of meters deep, deeper in places, and it wouldn't be easy for the Russians to cross. There's a coast road there. If the Ukrainians came down this way, now it's quite a long way to go, but if they went all the way down there, their aim would be to cut off the coast road, or to get close enough to be within howitzer range of it, so the Russians can no longer use it. They already are well within range of the railway lines which are up here. So essentially, Russians can't supply Melitopol by railway, which is the main way of supplying them. They could supply them via Crimea, but the Kerch Bridge cuts that off. And they can't supply them this way because the railway lines go like that. They can supply them by road, but road is much slower. So that's why the further you go, the more difficult it is. So supplying Kherson by road is very difficult because it's a very long journey, and they'd have to keep driving back and forth with trucks all the way back, and all the way there, and all the way back, and all the way there, and all the way back, every time they need to supply something over. And trucks are slower and more difficult and don't carry nearly so much as a railway line. And they don't have many trucks. They don't have enough trucks. So the cutting off the Kherson railway line, they get big supply problems with Kherson and big supply problems with Melitopol, which led to some people thinking, Ukrainians may be thinking about attacking there or attacking there. I've got the diagrams there. But it could be anywhere, it could be somewhere further up that way. And they are aiming, and they also are attacking here. So, I explained in my previous video that there's a place here called Bakhmut, an undistinguished small city, 70,000 people in peacetime, and no particular political significance, no particular strategic significance, that Russia has been using its best Wagner fighters, its most fierce fighters, to try to get this place for weeks now. And nobody knows why they're so focused on Bakhmut. And they managed to advance very slowly over the last few weeks. And in the last couple of days, Ukraine did a kind of minor, big counteroffensive back there. And they won back all the land that the Wagner fighters had been fighting to take in the last several weeks, in just a couple of 2-3 days. It must be very demoralizing for the soldiers, been fighting and had been trying and managed to make this progress gradually over several weeks. Then Ukraine gets it all back again. So that may have been just intentionally demoralizing them. And then they attacked, this is more strategic value up here. There's a city called Svatovi here, and they're quite close to capturing it. They're at the top of a hill, and the Svatovi is the bottom of the valley. And so the Ukrainians have captured some of the settlements, very small places, 2-3 houses, little villages, hamlets at the top of the valley, and they are kind of quite, if they do another big surge, they'd rush down the valley and capture Svatovi. And then if they did that, and then they capture it from this side, then they'd cut off the entire northern frontier between Kharkiv Oblast and Luhansk Oblast, with the main road that supplies it. And that would mean that basically the Russians were almost impossible to supply this area. And then that would open up the front there to attack into Luhansk much further. And then if they did that, they would cut off the main railway supply routes from Belgorod to Donetsk. So if they could get all the way here and get within shooting range of those railway supply, within, what is the distance, whatever the M77 howitzers, 30 kilometers or something, maybe it's more than that, if they could get that close to the railway lines, then it would be very difficult for the Russians to supply Donetsk. They also have supplies this way into Donetsk, but they're not nearly such high capacity railway lines. And it's a much more long, complicated route. So that would be a very strong strategic significance. The main thing that is slowing them down, so they rushed very quickly through the Kharkiv Oblast, but that was in the drier weather, it's now much muddier, so it's much harder to advance. So they might or mightn't do a big advance there now, or they might be putting it off until it freezes. If they get a cold winter, then they could charge in again, like they did with Kharkiv. And if not, they probably keep edging in and firing from the distance. So that's the basic strategic situation there. It's somewhat drier in the southern areas. Like the mud season starts earlier there than it starts there. And so it's still fairly dry there. And it is generally dry along the coast. So if they get all the way to the coast, then it'd be quite dry. And so the Ukrainians might be considering pushing a bit further there. They might be considering a big counteroffensive there. Might be considering there. They might just be messing with the Russians and not planning anything, and just actually you're just messing with them and firing at them from a distance. But they do seem to be gearing up to a big counteroffensive. They keep pretending that they're about to take Kherson, and the Russians rush across and retreat, and then they rush and try and rush things back into Kherson when they change their mind and decide the Ukrainians aren't really advancing, and then the Ukrainians hit them again, and then they rush back, and all the time they try to rebuild the bridges across to Kherson, and this time they built this big barge bridge onto the Antonovsky Bridge to Kherson, and then when it was completed, the Ukrainians kind of very skillfully sunk just one barge at the coastal side, and they sunk it near the coast instead of in the middle, where if it had just been washed down, then they could have put another barge in its place. But they sunk it near the edge, so it sunk a couple of meters, enough so it was no longer a passable road, and then it got stuck on the bed of the river, and it was no longer useful for the Russians. So the Russians then have to mend it again. They wait until they've completely mended it, and then they damage it again. So, because they've got these very precise HIMARS, and they can just basically target just there, and hit this particular barge at this particular point with this particular intention. And so, that's basically they're playing cat and mouse, really. Like the way that cats let mice go and let them run around a bit and then catch them again. And that's basically what the Ukrainians are doing with Kherson, with the Russians in Kherson. They're just playing games with them, and letting them build the bridges, and as soon as the bridges are the temporary pontoon bridges are complete, they then zap them again, and they build them again, and then they hit them again. They're just making things very difficult for the Russians. Basically playing cat and mouse with the Russians. And the Russians probably know that, but they don't really have many options except to keep trying. So it's pretty obvious what the Ukrainians are doing, it's pretty obvious what the Russians are doing. And so the Ukrainians are teasing them by claiming that they're going to take Kherson. At some point they probably will take Kherson, but it's not clear when. They're probably not going to take it with head-on, street-to-street fighting like the Russians were expecting, because that's the Russian approach, losing large numbers of their soldiers. The Ukrainian approach is much more subtle, is to keep cutting them off, wait until they run out of shells, wait until they run out of tanks. They'll try them from time to time and see if they've got any shells and tanks left. If they have, they obviously got to be left a little bit longer before they can be attacked. That's basically and then intelligence, using intelligence to know what to do. So the Ukrainians likely have several possible plans, but they're not ones to do kind of bold things. They did this big bold attack in Kharkiv that was obviously based on excellent intelligence. So they have much better intelligence than the military analysts I follow have. They have the access to knowledge from the spy satellites that the US have. They have intelligence from the cyber snooping. They have intelligence from listening in on conversations that the Russians have with each other and with their generals through the it isn't all obviously going to be released and shown and uploaded on the internet. So they have lots and lots of intelligence like that. And then they know where their old soldiers are, and they know what's happened. And they've got lots of, they've got their drones that they fly over the Russian front lines to look and see what's happening. And, or they fly just up high and look at them from a distance. And they've got their radar. So the Ukrainians have far more intelligence than the military analysts that I follow. And there are people who have secret knowledge, and some of them tweet on Twitter, but they obviously don't tweet their secret knowledge that the Ukrainians have. So it's impossible for us to know what Ukraine is actually planning, even if we had the best military strategists in the world. Then either they don't know, like Professor of Strategy in University of St Andrews, he hasn't got any secret knowledge, and that hasn't said he has anywhere. If he has, seems unlikely he has, because he's like a professor of military history. And then others who probably do have secret knowledge, but they're just not sharing it. Others who definitely have secret knowledge, like the Ukrainian generals or Zelensky, and they're obviously not, and the US Ministry of Defense, and they share some things on Twitter. They obviously don't share their secret knowledge. So it's impossible for us. We can't second guess the Ukrainians. Nobody can guess what their actual decisions will be. Nobody you follow either has the knowledge, or if they have the knowledge, they're not disclosing it. And they're definitely not going to let on any Ukrainian secret plans. What I've said so far is what the Russians could tell by just following Twitter accounts on Twitter, and public knowledge. So, there's nothing here that isn't public knowledge. So, so that's Russia knows all this at all. At least they've got any half-decent generals, which they don't seem to have any. Their generals seem to be very rubbish at strategy. They do seem to miss even very obvious things like this. And you get people saying things on Twitter, and everyone on Twitter is talking about it, and they say, if Russia was very stupid, they would do X. And then a few days later, Russia does X. And they get all the bad consequences that the people on Twitter have been shouting for the last week. So it's clear that the Russian generals aren't reading Twitter, although they would get some excellent advice if they did read Twitter, if they read the experts there. But they're following their own drill. They're digging their own trench, as it were. They're drilling their own drill. I'm applying metaphor, I can't remember the actual drilling, I can't remember the metaphor. A metaphor that you're applying your own drill. You do wiggly lines. Everyone else does straight lines, but you're doing wiggly lines because you're just doing your thing. And the generals are doing these things that just don't make any sense. And it may be that they are believing their own soldiers on the front line who are giving them misleading information. And so they think they're better information than everyone else, but they actually have worse information. And that may be what's going on, and why they are doing such dumb strategy. But anyway, because they've got this, Russia says, has a kind of praising very brutal commanders that keep their underlings under very, very strict control. And this is being praised in Soviet military and now in Russian military. And this sets up a situation where the underlings are afraid to tell the truth to their commanders. And they're afraid, and they're not permitted to make any initiative because of this idea of brutal and telling everyone exactly what you've got to do and being very strong. It's a kind of alpha male kind of thing, like big gorillas saying, you've got to do what we've got to do. Not real gorillas, because they're much more gentle animals, but the actual mythical gorillas. So they're basically like that, like movie gorillas or something, and not like King Kong was quite gentle actually, but if you look at the in some ways, but if you look at the Russian generals, and they behave like that, and so this has two problems. The first problem is that the people on the ground, the soldiers, they aren't able to take any initiative. So we had 90 odd tanks of the First Guards Tanks Army from Moscow sitting in Izium waiting for orders from their commander and their general. And they wanted to evacuate Izium because they could see that they were being entrapped by the Ukrainians. And they'd be cut off to the north, to the south, and then the line that was leading back, the only remaining road to the east, was getting fire from the north and south as well. And they knew if they didn't retreat soon, then they had no chance of retreating with their tanks. And they said, can we retreat? And their command said, no. Putin's told you to stay. Well, probably Putin had told them to say. We don't know for sure, this is a guess. But it seems like one of the eccentric things that Putin has been saying during the war. So they just waited there until finally the last exit route had been cut off. And so Russia lost nearly an entire division's worth of tanks, half the tanks that they had of their elite tanks to protect Moscow in a single day, as a result of the underlings at the lowest level being given no independent authority to make their own decisions that we have to retreat with our tanks. And then they weren't given independent authority to blow up their tanks. So very occasionally the general has told the underlings to blow up their tanks. It only happened once in this war, in the Battle of Kiev, once in the Battle of Kiev. That's the only time. And so these people weren't given instructions to blow up their tanks, so they didn't. And 36 of those tanks, the Ukrainians would have blown up from their own initiative. They'd have used some of the tanks to shoot the other ones, and then any that were left, they'd have thrown in the grenades and blown them up. Russia we haven't been given the orders. We can't take on the initiative to blow up a multi-million-dollar tank on our own account. So they just let Ukraine drive them away, and there are 36 tanks added to the Ukrainian army, elite tanks, the very best Russian tanks. So that is the problem that the Russians have. No initiative at the basic level, and then the basic level just lie to their superiors, because superiors expect the underlings to be 100%, 110, 200% competent. So they expect them to work wonders, so they just say, yes, we did exactly what you said. We had 8 helicopters fly out. They did everything they were supposed to do, when in fact only 2 took off and only 1 got there. And the commander gets totally unrealistic information. So that's probably partly why the Russian command is making such dumb decisions. And this is not going to be changed. It can't be changed in the course of this war. It's just too ingrained. And Putin has made it worse by appointing one of the most ruthless commanders to be in charge of the entire war, which means he's getting almost no sensible information from the front lines, and he's giving no initiative to the front lines. So this is that's Russia's situation, and they have the easy front ramp, and so Russia's going to lose. The question is how long, how quickly. Once at some point this is going to happen. It may happen now. It may happen if we get a cold winter. It'll definitely happen then, when you have frozen ground and they can drive over those with their tanks. And then, if not, in the next spring, then eventually Ukraine will get the capabilities to drive through, and then Russia will be absolutely helpless. And then Russia will try to dig in, but it will find it very difficult to dig in, because HIMARS will be able to hit any of their trenches and any of their outposts and any of their ammunition dumps up to somewhere around there. It's about there they can reach. All that area they can't really dig in very effectively. But Ukraine will definitely be wanting to take a little bit more ground there, get within a hitting distance of Ukraine, if they can, to break through there, and to get through there and cut through the supply lines to Donetsk, if they possibly can, before winter approaches. So those would be their three main objectives, but they might be able to achieve them. But certainly, if they get the opportunity, they'll be doing at least some of those three things, and possibly other things that our military analysts that I follow haven't even thought of, because they don't have the intelligence that the Ukrainians have. So they might have some completely surprising, out of left field, completely unexpected manoeuvres they do, counteroffensive that they do, that's nobody has even thought of, because they have much better intelligence. So that's basically what's happened. Ukraine is going to easily off-ramp is Russia to withdraw, and then after Ukraine wins the war, or Russia withdraws of its own account to the 2014 boundary, Russia will need to change its constitution. And surely, if it does sign a treaty, and it will include war reparations, which will be something like $1.1 billion already, and it's probably going to be much more than that. We've got these much better air defense systems in place. That's how I talked about that. Yeah, over $1 trillion. It's 1.1 trillion, not billion, $1.1 trillion. And so what Russia's going to do, I mean, it'll be too much for the Russian economy, actually, to pay all the fair war reparations. So probably, but in a peace treaty, they probably would be required to pay hundreds of billions in war reparations. Who knows? Maybe, or they have some kind of debt for the next several decades to try and repay them. And then Ukraine will rebuild, but most of all, it's going to come probably from the EU giving them rather easier loans, and seeing this as being it's a great economic opportunity for the EU, actually. Rebuilding a country is very revitalizing, lots of jobs. It could be lots of jobs for Ukraine, lots of jobs for other countries too, to rebuild Ukraine. So the EU would be financing it with loans, probably, very easy loans, maybe even interest-free or low-interest loans, maybe some grants involved, and they'll probably be giving, they will be giving tens of millions or hundreds of millions, maybe billions of dollars to Ukraine. But they're actually going to profit from that. So, it's going to be a very revitalizing thing to European economy, rebuilding Ukraine once the war is over. So don't think of it as like poor Ukraine, because they're going to be the center of an industrial boom for a few years as they rebuild their economy, and because there's a very huge commitment to rebuild the Ukrainian economy from the rest of Europe. They're not going to fall back on that. They're definitely going to be pouring hundreds of billions of dollars eventually into Ukraine in one way or another, which is then going to revitalise the economy, and then that then enables Ukraine to do more, because they've got such a vibrant economy. Once they're rebuilding, then they have money to invest themselves also into rebuilding, and then the whole thing kind of virtuous circle. So Ukraine will be able to rebuild, and they're going to presumably going to rebuild better. And that's the whole idea of rebuilding better, is to rebuild and hopefully rebuild. They haven't said anything about it, but I expect something like green economy and renewables, and then they will also, and their health systems and infrastructure, much better infrastructure and things like that, much better railways, much better roads and so on. You can expect that to happen. And so we can expect. And then Russia is never going to be threatening Ukraine again after this war is over. They have completely lost, they've already lost the capability. If you could take Russia as it is now and Ukraine as it is now, roll the time back to February 24, Russia could never invade Ukraine. Wouldn't have even the remotest possible chance. So with Ukraine with HIMARS and M77s, back then Ukraine had the javelins, and it had just started having the javelins and the Stingers, and even then it was doing quite a lot to stop Russia. But now with M77s and the HIMARS and all the other things that Russia and the HARM, anti-radar things, and many different bizarre and modern things that Ukraine now has, and then Russia, with most of its equipment gone, no more precision, very little in the way of precision munitions. 65,000 soldiers seem to have died, and many tens of thousands, probably equal number, or probably usually several times that number, have been injured. So there's not much left of the original 200,000 soldiers. A very significant fraction, a third of them have been killed, and probably 2/3 of them have been injured since the war started. I mean, that's why Russia needed so many conscripts, because the conscripts are pretty useless. And so Russia, and not only that, Russia has lost its capability to defend itself against NATO for many years to come. As I said, the Russian First Guards Army that is supposed to defend Moscow and Russia against a NATO conventional attack and do counter-attacks. Not much of it left now. If you look at all the forces that are supposed to defend the Baltic states and Kaliningrad from Ukraine, most of them are now fighting in Ukraine. If you look at the islands that Russia claims near to Japan, most of those were sent to Ukraine. If you look at Syria, most of the Russian forces in Syria and the Russian military sisters in Syria were sent to Ukraine. So Russia has lost its capability to fight external wars all over the globe as a result of the Ukrainian war. And it's never going to have the sphere of influence it had on the 24th of February, not for many years. And every single brigade, every single division, every single, whatever you call it, the largest divisions in regiments and brigades, and every single army, regiment, brigade, any large unit that Russia had, then a significant fraction of it has gone to the Ukrainian war. And these things learn to, they have a general that they've worked with for their working lifetime. The soldiers know this general, the divisions know the battalions, the units, the commanders, they all know that particular general, they're used to working with them. And when the war started, Putin didn't send one of these brigades or regiments to Ukraine as a single unit. He sent some soldiers from all of them. And he's kept that pattern ever since. And so they saw soldiers from many different divisions who have never, almost never worked together with each other, maybe occasional military exercises, don't know each other's generals, don't know how each other's brothers think or function, all fighting the Battle of Kiev. In one town, you'd have 2-3 different groups of people. You'd have the Falcon Knights, you'd have one division, you have one brigade, one regiment, another one, and they're all fighting in this one particular town. Very, very bizarre. And the way they did it. And then there's very little communication between them, and each had their own individual commanders. So one commander was commanding one, and one was commanding the other, and the commanders weren't talking to each other very much. So one would do one thing in one part of the town, the other would do another thing in another town, and they're not talking to each other, and not coordinating. And the Russians weren't coordinating the people on the ground in the tanks with the planes. So one person would say, we need helicopters, we need planes, but they were doing something else, so they couldn't get there. That's called combined operations, and Russia have been rubbish all the way through this war by combined operations. They're not able to get their helicopters and planes to do the things that the soldiers on the ground want them to do. And so they've been hugely uncoordinated, and really they're just not a modern army at all. It's very much like an army of World War II, but not even really as coordinated as one of those. And it's just not sensible strategy. So as a result of this, Russia has lost just about all its capability to defend Russia. It's only got its nukes and its deterrent, and you have a few thousand soldiers that are still experienced here and there. It's a very threadbare army now as a result of the Ukraine war. And they've lost their military trainers. And the Soviet used to keep lots of skeleton armies that could be expanded into full units, and lots of trainers ready to do conscription and to start and to mobilize hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Russia haven't done that. So they've got this 300,000 mobilized reservists, so as they so call them. They're more like conscripts, most of them, and with no previous experience. But they're supposed to, on paper. Anyway, these reservists have got nobody to train them. And Putin has done a kind of, he's done a special academy to train these 300,000 reservists. He's capped at a few dozen trainers. Nowhere near enough to train them all. And then he's got whatever he's got left of his military trainers that he had before. So he's never going to be able to get 300,000 soldiers with 6 months of training, even after 6 months, because he just hasn't got the military trainers to do that. He's not building up the military trainers to do that. So Russia, even 6 months from now, in the spring, is not going to have a significantly better army than it does now. So that's the situation in Ukraine. So anyway, so Russia has lost this war. There's no way and the Russian economy is tanking as well, and maybe the Russian economy that eventually pressurizes them to eventually end this war, because a war like this is not good for the Russian economy at all. It's very bad for the Russian economy. And then they've got all the, because it's so expensive and achieving nothing, and the having a constant requirement to send all these, and sending all these trained people. He's sending lots of 700,000 or something Russians have left. Some of them of their best trained people have left Russia because they don't want to be conscripted, and others have been sent as conscripts to the front lines, and it's just not good for the Russian economy. And then you've got all the sanctions. and many industries, like for instance the Russian rolling stock, the carriages and the trains, they use components that are needed, that they import from, I can't remember, some Canada's, or is it some European country? Anyway, they can't import these anymore. And eventually their wheels are going to stop running, so they're going to have to stop using them. And their planes also, they're only passenger planes as well as their military planes. And and then all their missiles and things. And then they've got all their pilots who are dying in the war, and so they're fighter pilots. But that's why I was talking about the economy. So over a period of time, the Russian economy is being affected by this as well, and then they're running out of their shells. They're not going to be able to keep this going. And anyway, so I say try not to get too caught up in the war, because try and ground yourself in kindness and look at the future, the flag of the wonderful Russia of the future. This is an idea of a peaceful, law-abiding future Russia. And Russia is probably going to become, it's not clear that it's going to be able to hold together. And we may have something like the split up of the Soviet Union. There's some parts of Russia that want to leave, like Chechnya, for instance, and I remember some of the other places. Even Siberia may want to leave Russia if it goes far enough. As Moscow gets weaker, and as the economy gets weaker, and as the benefits of being part of the Russian Federation become less and less clear to them, then quite a few of the less strongly attached regions of Russia want to become separate and become separate federation. This is not going to lead to a world war, and we will need to be careful about what happens to nukes, just as with the breakup of the Soviet Union. So this is a possible result of Putin's invasion, that it may lead to the breakup of the Russian Federation, especially if he keeps on doing this more and continues for several more months. Then at some point it just gets too much, and they lose Crimea, and then probably other parts of the Federation will say, well, why are we part of this anymore? Perhaps it's time for us to leave. And then if there's enough sentiment of that, and with Moscow getting weaker and weaker, then at some point some of them may leave. It's not possible at the moment, but at some point in the future it may happen. But it's not a future to be worried about. It's a future of eventually leading to a much more peaceful Europe, where Russia can't threaten, and where hopefully Russia, nukes are quite expensive, and a much weaker economy and a much smaller Russia won't be able to keep up so many nukes, and that will be another incentive to reduce the number of nukes. So we may well be looking forward to a future of a much more peaceful future in Europe, middle of the 20s, or even next year it might start to be heading for that process. And then you think about the ordinary Russians, most of them are not keen on this war, or don't understand what it's all about, and especially with mobilization, more and more are not keen. And many people who've known most about what's happened haven't been keen on the war since the war started. So try to develop a kindness towards both the Ukrainians and the Russians, and the Russian conscripts and the mobilized Russians, and for the most peaceful mind of all. And this is not so easy to do, because you think it's natural to feel angry, natural to feel some resentment, natural to feel he's a bad person. Think about someone like Putin. But if you can feel even kindness towards Putin, then this leads to the most peaceful mind of all. And this leads to the most benefit to other people around you. Because it doesn't benefit anyone to be to feel anger and hatred towards Putin. It doesn't benefit Putin in any way. It doesn't harm him in any way or reduce his influence to experience hatred towards him. All it harms is yourself and other people around you, because you're not able to help them so much. So if you can manage to feel kindness even towards Putin, and the way to think about that is to think about how much. Think first of all about his mind. And he hasn't got a calm, peaceful mind. He can't have. So, if you have faith, he obviously would have some feelings of warm feelings towards his own children and his consort, whatever you call her, and his girlfriend, and some of the people around him. But he obviously can't have a normal way of thinking about most people, about the Ukrainians. He can't have what we think of as being a normal, warm, clear, kind mind. If you don't have a kind mind, that's a very sad state to be in. So you can think about Putin and think, he doesn't have a mind that I wouldn't want to have his mind. I don't think many of us would want to have Putin's mind. Very, very unpleasant state of mind to be in. You wouldn't want to be like that, would you? So, and then try to think, well, I wouldn't want to be like that. Putin, if he had any sense, wouldn't want to be like that. So there's some kind of confusion there, and also some kind of really unpleasant state of mind that nobody else would want a state of mind like that. So then you can start feeling compassion for him and think, it must be really awful to be Putin. It must be a terrible state of mind to be Putin. I wouldn't want to be Putin in 1,000 years. So then you can start feeling kindness and compassion and feel even great sadness and sorrow, and think about all the harm that he's doing to other people, and how awful it must be to have done such harm. And think of him if sometime in the future, say he's brought to justice, say eventually he loses his position as president, and then he is like Amnesty International people thinking about, it's not right to execute people. They need to have they need to be instead kept in prison, because we have no idea what's going to happen to them in the future. Over many years in prison and thinking over what he'd done and decades, and he can become a different person. People do change, and then he might hugely regret everything he's done, and then think back and think, what on earth kind of was I thinking back then? What kind of person was I? I don't recognize that person as being me anymore. And this does happen. You get people who have done awful things, mass murderers and things, who then later in their life, they do genuinely change. So that there is that possibility. So, and the way Buddhists think about it is that everyone is a future Buddha. Even Putin. We think of everything as being really quite superficial. And so it's not likely in this life, but in future lives, time after time after time after time, maybe sometimes he's reborn as a monkey, as a tiger, as a cow. And in the far, far future, this is Buddhist thinking. Not, I'm not saying many of you won't be Buddhists, but for people who do think like this, it's a quite useful way of thinking. Then, you don't blame a cow, because sometime in the way past it was Putin. And so it's gradually over long periods of time, then he can change and become a different creature, different being. He can become very kind. He can develop a flexible mind. He can develop intelligence. He can develop wisdom. So Putin doesn't have wisdom in the ordinary sense now, as we understand it. he's making these very dim decisions. So you think that, so people think of him as being, he's really a future Buddha. All beings are future Buddhas. If you can't start thinking about this, and then you think about all the future time, then think about future time and the present, and really, what is the difference between the past, future, and the present? Then you start thinking, well, really, there's a Buddha there now, right now. The potential for Buddha in the far future, he's not actually essentially different from this future Buddha.